We're going to continue the talk with the goddamn white man and the plight of the Tasmanian people. The definition of the term plight is that it's a dangerous, difficult, or otherwise unfortunate, even quite horrid situation. Tasmania was a penal colony colonized by the British, the goddamn white man, in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And at that time, it was peopled by Aboriginals who had been there for over 40,000 years, and they numbered conservatively around 45 to 55,000 people. So 45 to 55,000 inhabitants of the island before the British came there. A whole generation, a whole race of peoples in Tasmania were basically wiped off the earth by the British colonists and the criminals. Okay, it's been bothering me for a number of years. Why did this happen? What happened in Tasmania? Who is the Tasmanian devil? Where did the term Tasmanian devil come from? Now, one of the stories I heard when I was a teenager looking into this was that the Europeans would call the Tasmanians devils in order to dehumanize them, in order to objectify them, in order to lessen their guilt and responsibility for murdering them. It's just a common ploy that people use throughout war tactics, throughout history. For example, in the Vietnam War, I'm given to understand that the Americans called the Vietnamese gooks, or geeks, or gooks, and
Viet Cong,
chinks, and other forms of slander. In the Second World War, the British called the Germans jerrys,
Krauts,
Nats, and what have you. In Sudan, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, the Europeans and the Americans call the Africans skinnies. In the Iraqi war, in Iraqi Storm, what do we call it, Desert Storm and Desert Shield, they call the Iraqis and the Afghanis ragheads. So these terms are used in order to justify your wanton wickedness against another person. It's a psychological mechanism which is used in order to justify your barbaric or your murderous intent and behavior on other people. It helps to act as a nullifier or a buffer against the guilt complex or against the post-traumatic stress disorder, which will result as a rise of having the weight of another man's life on your soul. So dehumanize them, call them Tasmanian devils. I've heard all sorts of horrid stories. You can find out for yourself what the true term of the true definition or the true origin of the term is. But you look into it, these Europeans were kind of wicked and crazy. When the British came to Australia and to Tasmania, why did they seek to systematically murder and massacre the Aboriginals? When the British and the Europeans first came to the black lands and black peoples of the faces of the earth, why did they just want to murder everybody and kill everybody? What reason was there? What rationale behind them was there? Was it because they felt themselves to be superior? Was it because of the law of the mercantile elite? Was it about the rule of law? Was it about re-equalizing God's commandments on the planet Earth? Was it about the law of the rule Britannia? Or is it just plain old greed and devilishment? Is it just plain greed? And is it just the goddamn white man that had the mindset that it was okay to eliminate and murder entire populations of people that were there before they came? It's been said to me, it's been suggested to me that there is not one place on the face of the whole earth where the white man, where the European has been, where the people that were there before they came have not been completely annihilated and destroyed and disrupted. Okay, get back to the question. Was it because the manifest destiny of the Europeans was to cajole and conquer the rest of the world? Was it because they were doing God's bidding and they were the right arm of God? Was it because of social Darwinism and the theories of the origin of species and the preservation of the most favored races? Was it because those theories made it okay? Was it because it was just a free-for-all and you could go wherever you wanted in the face of the earth and take and plunder and pillage and murder and commit mayhem and do whatever you wanted? Was it because that when they went there they only saw animals living on the land and not humans? That's why the Tasmanians were reduced to the status of savages and animals and dehumanized. The human beings that were already there were relegated to the level of beast, dog, animal, inferior, uneducated, animalistic, primitive, savage, backward, and they needed the white man's help to bring them up into civility and civilization. That's why they wiped them out.
What had happened in Tasmania was far from being a unique event. Across the world, indigenous peoples were being pushed to the brink of extinction. In the South African Cape, the Khoisan peoples had been driven from their land, enslaved and killed in their thousands by British settlers and the Boers. The same forces had also attacked the ancient San Bushmen of the Kalahari, hunting them down as if they were animals. In Newfoundland, the native Beothuk peoples had been completely wiped out by Europeans. And in South America, wars of extermination sanctioned by the Argentinian government were raging against the Pampas Indians. Everywhere, it seemed, white settlers were destroying indigenous peoples.
Hotep, everyone, welcome back for another edition of Truth Seekers. Now this right here is part 4 of Do Black Lives Really Matter in This Nation? I know that was very graphic for a lot of people to watch. There were some graphic scenes in that clip. But I felt the need to share that with y'all because these are things of history that we don't know. Why has that Black War not been taught in government school, public school system? I never learned about the Black War. I'm sure many of you never learned about the Black War. Well, at least not in government school system, not in public school, perhaps not in Catholic school, perhaps not in private school. Okay? But this is a part of history, man. This is an actual part of history. The part of history that they don't want us to know. The part of history, as I keep saying, they continuously try to cover up and sweep it under the rug as if it never happened. You know, and like I'm always saying, as soon as one of us, someone of African descent, black people if you will, steps up and says, oh, you know, this racism, man, this shit is fucked up. Or this shit is wrong, what they doing to us. This shit is wrong, what they did to my ancestors. You get one of these racist white people that always want to jump up and say stuff like, oh, well, won't you go back to Africa? You're always complaining. But just like I said on part 3, we're not going back to Africa. We'll go back to visit so that we can see the legacy our ancestors left behind, what little of it is left, because so much of it has been erased from time. So much of it is now still today over in Egypt, Africa, being whitewashed, okay, if you will. But we'll go back to see the legacy of our ancestors and to visit our homeland, the motherland. But we have just as much claim on this land as, if not more, than any other race of people, because it was on the backs of slaves, my ancestors, your ancestors, that this nation was built. Now, before I go any further, let me just say this. As I always say, I am not trying to infuse any hatred in anyone. I am not trying to send a message of hate white people, down with whitey or whatever have you. That's not my message. I am simply trying to send a message of the importance of us as black people, African people, coming together, unifying. You understand what I'm saying? Because in numbers, we are powerful. But apart, we are nothing. We have no strength. And with this series, Do Black Lives Really Matter in This Nation, what I hope to do is to open up the pineal gland, the third eye of many of you, many people, especially people of African descent, because we need to start paying attention and being aware of the fact that there are many forces in this world, Okay, when I say forces, I'm speaking of the powers that be. There are many forces, there are many powers and entities in this world that do still to this day seek to destroy and annihilate the black man and the black woman. Not all black people. Many tribes, many different races of people, ethnic groups of people, indigenous people of this land, they seek to destroy. But it is mainly with the African man and the African woman. Okay? So, you know, speaking of that Black War, what a horrific thing. And then having the Governor George Arthur, even calling for martial law, allowing these British soldiers to go over there and kill all of the Tasmanian people, kill damn near all of the Aboriginal people. Now, I'll tell you about a part that I didn't show, excuse me, in any of those documentary clips. It was the part of when Governor George Arthur went to seek the help of a missionary by the name of Robinson. And he was a missionary who was sort of like a leader amongst the Aboriginal people. After Governor George Arthur and all of his other tactics had failed, you know, there was a time when the picture that you saw in part 3, the cartoon of the Aboriginal people and the British, see, that was a copy of a poster that he had placed all over that area on trees and so forth, because he was trying to attempt to get the Aboriginal people to believe that the British people, these European settlers, wanted to unify with them. So he was trying to attempt to bring forth peace and get the Aboriginal people to come out from hiding and to stop fighting. But that did not work. That plan failed. Now, another one of his plans was offering the British soldiers a compensation for each and every one of the Aboriginal people that they captured. That plan too did not work, because the Aboriginal people over time, because as you saw, this war went on for quite some time. Over time, the Aboriginal people, they learned how to hide, because they knew that area very well, because their people had been inhabiting that land for more than 20,000 years. Okay, so they learned how to hide from these Europeans, from these savage barbarians, British people. So these soldiers, they really couldn't catch nobody except 2 people. I believe it was a young boy and an older man. And they couldn't catch anybody because these people learned how to hide. But when he called upon this missionary by the name of Robinson went in and gathered what little bit of the Aboriginal people were left, which at this time, going from tens of thousands of Aboriginal people that were there in the beginning, okay, now there were only about 200, 300 Aboriginal people left. So anyway, what Robinson did was he took these Aboriginal people to this island some miles away from Tasmania, that island, okay? And he took them to this island called Flinders Island. They had homes built there for the Aboriginal people. They had church built there. They had it fixed up. They had it built up. And he named this place Point Civilization. Now, one of the things that he was trying to do was to civilize the Aboriginal people. Because as I told you in part 3, the Aboriginal people were said to be uncivilized, untamed. They were, how you say, prehistoric, if you will. So he took them over there with the hopes of civilizing them, teaching them about Christianity and so forth, because this was one of the main things about these white people, to thrust upon all black people Christianity being the number one religion of the new world. Okay, perhaps in part 5 I'll talk to you a little further about that, but as for now, I'm just going to leave it at that. But yes, Christianity was one of the number one, religions of the new world. And by orders of the Pope, it was said to spread it all throughout the new world. So this is one of the things that he was trying to do with the Aboriginal people, because they were said to be primitive, ungodly, uncivilized, basically not even worthy of living, which is why they felt it was okay to go over there and kill all of these people, pillage their homes, their land. But all of these things that went on throughout history, and we know nothing about, because it's not being taught on channels like the History Channel. Okay, you might see certain things, but when you get into the graphics of it, the realness of it, the barbarism of it, you're not being taught about this stuff on this media. You're not being taught about this stuff in government school. All of this stuff has been whitewashed. All of this stuff has been edited. Much of it has been canceled out altogether. So, it's just so horrible, man. And then you gotta wonder, you have to wonder, do black lives really matter in this nation? Do lives really matter in this nation, for that matter? Because things like this should have never even been allowed to happen. You understand? Who gives a person the right to decide who should live and who should not live? Who gives a person the right to decide what part of the land you have a right to live on? You understand what I'm saying? It's just so many things that go on in this nation that are just not right, that are just unspiritual, ungodly. Okay? And at the end of the day, it's like so many things are being changed every day for the better. But when we look back at history and we learn of things of this nature taking place, and we see the things that still take place today, these cops, they kill, they maim, and they walk away with a slap on the wrist. They get to go back to their jobs. What? They get suspended for a couple of months, something like that, with pay, most cases, and then it's all over. You understand what I'm saying? They run these episodes, they run it on CNN and MSGN, Channel 5, Channel 11, Channel 9 News, Channel 7 News for a couple of weeks, and then you don't hear no more about it. It just fades to the back, if you will. And then we have all of these organizations such as Black Lives Matter. I think it's beautiful what this organization is trying to do as far as the black community is concerned. But at the end of the day, you can't just come out when someone has wound up dead. We need to be making an appearance on a regular basis, letting our voices be heard on a regular basis, because this is the only way that things like this, we can ensure that things like this will never happen again. But you know what? That was just one incident with the Aboriginal people. What I want to do now with you is I want to share another clip with you about yet another tribe of people, African people, whom were annihilated. The first incident, first case of a concentration camp, a place known as Shark Island. Some more graphic scenes, so parental discretion is advised. But I want to share this with you, so sit back and hold tight and check out this clip.
This is Namibia, but at the dawn of the 20th century, it was the German colony of southwest Africa and home to an ancient people called the Herero. In 1904, they rebelled against the brutality of German rule. What followed was to prefigure the worst crimes of the 20th century. The Germans committed innumerable massacres and atrocities, but they were unable to hunt down and destroy all the Herero people across such a vast landscape. And when the Nama, another of the Namibian peoples, rose up, the Germans turned instead to a recent invention, the concentration camp. In these camps, the Herero and Nama were imprisoned and enslaved. Thousands were worked to death, others raped, beaten, or simply murdered by the guards. The most infamous and deadly of the camps was at a place called Shark Island.
Shark Island was established for the express purpose of killing people. Anybody placed on that island, everybody knew they were going to die. People knew that, the German officers knew that. If I were to have to use the language of the Nazi period, then I would certainly see Shark Island as a death camp.
The people were band together in Shark Island from all over Namibia. Hereros, Tamaras, Bushman, Nama. And they had cold-blooded murder there. My own family, my ancestors, they were also killed there.
In this desolate place, on the southern edge of Africa, 3,500 people were exterminated with the speed and efficiency that was to become the hallmark of 20th century slaughter.
The genocides which took place in Namibia in 1904 to 1909, they are the precursor to what happens in the Nazi period. They are the precursor. They have the same symptoms in the sense that you can see the bureaucratization of mass killing. And this for me is the central thing. It's not just killing for killing. No. It's a combination between killing and bureaucracy.
Today, Shark Island is a campsite for tourists. The Africans who were frozen and starved to death here have been almost erased from memory. But a century after the Namibian genocide, the true horror of what happened on Shark Island is beginning to re-emerge. In a recently discovered mass grave, just a few kilometers from the site of Shark Island, lie some of the victims of the 20th century's first genocide. Other victims were denied even the meager dignity of a mass grave. They became the raw material of racial science. Their skulls and even severed heads were sold to museums in Europe and used to prove the inferiority of Africans. The trade in skulls was so accepted that it was even depicted on a postcard.
So now, you've watched that clip. Another tragic incident. Another horrific crime committed at the hands of white people. All of these events that have occurred throughout history, where whole civilizations, whole groups of indigenous people, okay, tribes and so forth have you, being annihilated, having their homes being pillaged. All of these incidents have happened at the hands of white people. So, excuse me, people, if you don't like when I say that, but what else am I supposed to say? Because it's always been at the hands of white people. And the funny thing about that is they went places to settle, but they tried to settle on parts of land where people were already inhabiting, already living, had already begun civilization. You know, we go back through history, man. In another episode, I'm going to get deeper into this with y'all. We all come from the same gene pool. There is a such thing known as oculocutaneous. OC1, OC2, and OC3. It is a gene found in African people. It is the very gene that allows African people to create white albinoism. Many of you know it as the blue eyes, the gray eyes, the red hair, the freckles, you know, but this is a gene, especially OC3, that is only found in African people. See, white can't create black without the assistance of another black. I'm sure many of you have heard that, and you already know that. But now I have just given you some definition and a name for it. And my thing is, you know, all of these tragic things that have occurred at the hands of these white people, like you went places where, like I said, people were already living there. They were already inhabiting that part of the land. Civilization had already begun there. But because of that barbaric mentality that they have, that says that we can do this, we can destroy, we can enslave, we can kill. You understand what I'm saying? We can pillage and all of these things. The malice in their heart. Where does that all stem from? Where does that all stem from? That right there, I don't know if I'll ever know the answer to that. But what I do know is that you went into these places, you see that people are already living there, but you decide, instead of saying, you know, let's share the land. Let's share this land because it's plenty. It's bountiful. There's enough of this land for us to share. No, you want to kill. You want to destroy. You want to eradicate and annihilate whole civilizations. And you know, these parts of history, I know that it is very hard for many of you to deal with. It's hard for me to deal with. When I learn about these things, my heart is saddened. You know, sometimes I even have to shed a tear or two because it's a lot to deal with. And then you look to whomever you consider to be your God and you say, why are things like this allowed to happen? But then the pastors tell you, don't ask that question because you ain't supposed to question God. What's that about? See what I'm saying? All of these things, man, you know, stuff like that, like I said a little earlier, religion, Christianity is something that they forced upon African people. It's just history. It's in the history books. All you have to do is look it up. Go to your public library. Look it up on your phone, your laptop, your computer, your tablet, whatever have you. It's history. Okay? Not his story. This is history. This is the part of history that he has turned into his story because he does not want us to know real history. So, again, you know, all I can say is, you know, we got to start looking. Look with these eyes, but see with this eye, your third eye. Do not spend the rest of your life walking around with blinders on. And, you know, for the most part, don't ever walk around thinking that, although this was over 100 years ago, oh, that was so long ago. What that got to do with me? Listen to me. Do the math. 1803 is when it began with these British settlers settling over there in Tasmania, Australia, and the war broke out. They declared war amongst the Aboriginal and Tasmanian people. Okay? But when you do the math, counting up until now, present day, 2016, it is really only 174, 75 years ago. That may seem like a long, long time ago to many of you, but that really was not that long ago. Because as you all know, time flies at the blink of an eye. Okay? You wake up today and it's Monday. And then it seems like you turn your back and turn around and it's Saturday. Time flies at the blink of an eye, my people. So don't sit back and say, that was so long ago, what does that have to do with me? All of these events that took place hundreds of years ago have a lot to do with what is taking place today. And as I continue this series, Do Black Lives Really Matter in This Nation? We will delve further into these events and why it has so much to do with what is going on today. Just as I said to you in part 1, I believe it was part 1, part 1. They don't even want us to know that African people stood on the front line alongside of white people such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. Paul Revere was a black man riding with Paul Revere, shouting out, the British are coming, the British are coming. All of these things have been taken out of the history books. When we're in school, government school, they're teaching us about the Declaration of Independence. They're teaching us about the Constitution. But they're not teaching us about these things in its entirety. They are only teaching us about the parts that they want us to know. The rest, they leave out. And we have to go out and find out these things on our own. Just as I said to you in the videos that I did to you about this nation going from a country to a corporation. It is assumed that you know the law, along with everything else. It is assumed that we know these things. So when you're sitting back and you're saying to yourself, after watching videos like this, Wow, I never knew that. How come they never told me that? How come they didn't teach me that? Because it is assumed that you will care enough to want to know. They're not responsible for teaching you or your babies every little thing in elementary school. But so many of us, we walk around here thinking that when I send my child to school in the morning, my child is supposed to come home at the end of the 12 years after graduating from high school. My child is supposed to know everything about what occurred in this nation and everything that occurred throughout history. We send our kids to school, even some of us thinking that school is a babysitting program, that the teachers are supposed to teach our children everything from tying their shoe to using the bathroom, everything. No, much of this stuff we are responsible for teaching ourselves. But because I know that many of my brothers and my sisters and many people will not take the time to seek this information out, I have dedicated this channel to teaching it to you. So now, with that being said, I'm going to end part 4 of Do Black Lives Really Matter? But check out this clip that I have here about something we will pick up in part 5. Let's see what happened years down the line after all of these horrific incidents occurred. The Aboriginal people, the Herero tribe of South Africa, things were still going on. See, the gap that I told you about, we're going to fill that in. What happened between slavery, Jim Crow, and civil rights, that gap, we're going to fill that in. So sit back. I'll see you on the other side. Ashe.
Craniologist Samuel George Morton had begun to collect the skulls of different races and compare them.
Skulls were chosen to be measured because it was reckoned that the skull was the container of the most important part of the human body, the brain. The bigger the skull, the bigger the brain. The shape of the skull, the shape of the brain.
The American School of Race Scientists concluded that the races, as measured through their skulls, were so different as to be separate species. Tasmanians, Africans, American Indians were not the lower races of men. They were perhaps not fully human at all. One writer compared the extermination of these races by white settlers as being like the melting of snow before the advancing rays of the sun. But the theory that was to have the most powerful impact upon race came not from the anatomists or the skull measurers, but from the work of one of the 19th century's greatest minds.
At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Charles Darwin, 1890.
Charles Darwin is very well known for writing The Origin of Species in the 1800s. This book gave rise to evolutionary theory. What people don't know is that there was actually a longer original title to this book, and that was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, copies and editions that they made afterwards eliminated that phrase about the favored races. Evidently, they understood then that it was politically incorrect.
The social Darwinists predicted a future in which these races, like many animal species, would only be remembered as curios, stuffed exhibits in anthropological museums. The white man's burden and the Christian dream of benign imperialism were rendered obsolete. Race scientists and social reformers visited prisons to study the criminal races, and among them was Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. Galton was terrified by the fact that the underclass were reproducing faster than the middle classes. Darwinian law had, it seemed, been turned on its head. The least fit were surviving. Reversing this situation became his mission.
Darwin had looked backwards. Where had we come from? Galton turned the telescope around and looked forward. Where were we going? And he devoted much of the rest of his life to the idea of understanding Homo sapiens, us as a species, and trying to direct where Homo sapiens was going to go in order to become more sapient, more wise in the future, more of a genius, and less of what he saw, more stupid, more ignorant, and more decayed.
Galton designed a new science of human selective breeding. He dreamed of encouraging the middle classes to have more children and inhibiting breeding amongst the lower and criminal classes. And he named his new science eugenics. In the last decades of the 19th century, it became widely respected, attracting an array of high-profile supporters.
They included many of the great figures of the late 19th, early 20th century, people like George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Winston Churchill, all of them absolutely convinced eugenicists